want to move to sort of broad Q&A, and I'll actually ask one to start off that is back to you, Bindu, but asks you and Leon to connect your two projects and talks. It strikes me that the state of STEM education in BIPOC communities could be related in both directions with some of the findings you just presented, Bindu, about disproportionate exposure and vulnerability to environmental and lots of other hazards. So could I ask each of you, Bindu and Leon, to just react to each other's talks and see if those two things are related in interesting ways that you see?
Well, of course it is related. And I think you're talking also about capacities here. In Vermont, of course, there are very few people of color, but at the same time, are they all equally part or have a capability to be participating in decision-making around environmental justice, or have equal access to environmental education in the case of what Leon was talking about. So at the end of the day, what we want to look into is, what are the different ways we are addressing environmental justice in Vermont. So there are, even within distributive inequities, there are a number of ways of looking at it, and one of the ways of looking at it is through the information gap that is there between groups.
And just to follow up what Bindu was saying, my focus is not just on Vermont, obviously. The population that I'm really concerned with doesn't exist in large quantities here in the state. But ultimately, we all at this point are come to the realization that the system we have in place, that has allowed BIPOC folks to be excluded was short-sighted. And so organizations like, even the Gun Institute, National Science Foundation, they are specifically putting in clauses saying, okay, you want this money, you need to now figure out how you're going to get populations of color also involved in this thing. We have very short time to do that. We can't go through the whole string of K. We'll eventually have to do that, but we have to also deal with what's happening right now. And so the focus of bringing more BIPOC folks into environmental decision making and getting involved with understanding science relative to sustainability is really important.
Okay, thanks. So I'm gonna try my best to sift through all the Q&A and pick a kind of representative set, or a set that allows each of you to talk a little bit. And I'll just remind the speakers that you can go into the Q&A section and just type answers to ones that I may not get to. I have flagged the ones that I'm planning to bring up if there's time. So the next one's from Rigo Melgar. He's a grad student at UVM and in the Gun Institute. So his question is, has a better understanding of cultural ecosystem services, actually ecosystem services in general, has that helped us actually conserve ecosystems in the US and elsewhere? And what are the trade-offs between that way of looking at it and sort of economic hardship realities? He says it seems like economic growth imperative leads to further degradation of ecosystems and their services. So how can we conserve them in the face of that? And that's a question kind of for any of you, but maybe Jesse and Rachelle could start.
Yeah, I guess I can say a couple things. It's an awesome question and a huge question that comes up a lot in the ecosystem services world. So thank you. I guess two things occurred to me. One is that this point about economic growth, the economic growth imperative, that assumption is part of the conversation. And I think that's with ecological economics, questioning that as a goal. And for me, I think that is a goal that's particularly important to particular communities globally and historically. And so part of the work that Cultural Ecosystem Services is doing is trying to show that a lot of other kinds of values matter and should be part of the conversation. So that's one thing. And then the sort of trade-offs of non-material and material goods is part of what you're asking, I think, or non-material, material well-being, and that idea that sort of cultural services could be a luxury good, something that we can't afford if you're hungry and need physical support. And I think that happens sometimes, clearly. And then in a lot of cases, actually, there's a lot of overlap between people with who want to be able to support themselves and farm, fish, hunt, etc., and garden and have access to natural space that is very consistent. Marginalized communities often those values and the non-material values are really in line with economic growth and development and supporting themselves. Those are a few thoughts.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that. This is maybe kind of a roundabout way of answering your question, but I think there's long been this controversy about monetary valuation of ecosystem services, both in the ecosystem services and ecological economics community. I guess on the one hand, that metric is very salient to some decision makers and the public, and there's this thought is if we can value ecosystem services properly, then we can incentivize the adequate provision of them. I think there's very valid criticism that monetary valuation both masks the distribution of benefits and costs, as well as tends to bias decisions towards the wealthy. So I guess getting back to cultural ecosystem services, I think it's been kind of like obvious from the beginning that like valuation of cultural ecosystem services like just doesn't work very well. And so that arm of ecosystem services, I think, has really pushed forward these other types of metrics for understanding how people value services. And getting to Bindu's idea of like needs-based distribution, I think this feeds really directly into that of trying to deliver benefits to people who need them most, who are most vulnerable to the loss of those benefits. I think a lot of the metrics that have come out of the cultural ecosystem services literature very much gets at that idea.
Does anyone else want to add to this one? Okay, here's another really great general one. From Bobby Lucier. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. So he asks that anybody who wants to answer, how do you envision the work that you've presented? How do you envision it supporting BIPOC organizers that are aiming to push for structural social change? Have you been part of organizing efforts or reached out to them to offer your work as a tool for moving their work forward?
I can talk about that. So my work right from the beginning has been very community-based, participatory oriented, and have been working with many of the local community organizations and also some communities of color. And I am also working with people who are putting together policies related to environmental justice. So just recently, I know that Senator Ram is trying to push forth a bill on environmental justice. I've been part of that effort. There have been some other efforts that where people are trying to put in related kinds of legislation done through Renew Vermont on green justice zone and housing retrofits, all prioritizing low-income families and communities of color. So, these are things that I've been working on outside of research as well.
Yeah, I'll jump in there as well. I know Bindu has been doing, a number of people on this panel have been doing a lot of different forms of community-based work. I talked about this international work. I also do a lot of work locally in terms of food security, food access, and mostly with the resettled refugee communities here. And I think that it's an interesting question to sort of say, like, how does this connect to other kinds of work that's ongoing, and how specifically does it affect kind of notions of kind of structural change? And I think for me, there's so much of what we do that is simultaneously short and long term. I mean, fundamentally, I have many, many critiques of the refugee resettlement, system. The system is dependent on so many different kinds of deeply problematic notions. It's essentially a colonialist enterprise in all kinds of ways. Somebody else asked an interesting question about, Alejandra asked a question about linking the work with environmental racism and territories of non-white or so-called developing countries. And I think that also plays very much to the ways in which we understand space here too. I know Bindu and I have had many very interesting conversations about, like, a lot of the challenges of doing this kind of work over a long period of time, and the kinds of commitment and mistakes that involves, and the kinds of challenge that it involves. And I guess the main thing, I don't know if this is really answering the question that you pose, but one of the things I think a lot about is what it means to stay involved and engaged. It's great to have big moments of performative protest, or when you can hit the screens and the front pages, but like, how do you stay engaged in this kind of work on a much longer basis, especially when it becomes really uncomfortable? I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but I guess that's something that I think about a lot, and I know Bindu and I have talked about a lot.
I'd like to add to what Pablo was saying too. One of the things that I've come to an understanding of is that we as a society can't wait for society to get to where we need to go. We have so many ingrained problems. One of which is segregation, which is putting a big dent in things. So my idea is, because we can't wait, my focus is working within school district, working within education in order to kind of maybe institute some change from the inside out. We can do some things within some context that may influence the society at large, but waiting for what we might consider equity and policy changes, structural changes eliminated, that's going to require a lot of time. It took us a lot of time to get here. It's going to take us a lot of time to get out of this. And the things that we're discussing here today can't wait for that.
That's great. No one else seems to be jumping into that one. And it's an interesting sort of preview or pre-answer to the question I wanted to ask next, which is from Lizzie Lohr. And she kind of points out nicely that the disparities and vulnerabilities, the disparities in access to ecosystem services and benefits from them, that several of these talks point out, they're clearly also related to disparities in the distribution of decision-making power. And so is there a way to find ways to quantify those disparities in decision-making power? And what do you all believe would be the best ways to actually get those most vulnerable and directly impacted a voice at the decision-making table? So can we measure that other form of inequity, and can we address it as a way of addressing the ones that you guys are measuring and reporting on today?
Can I know we're almost out of time, a really quick response that combines my response to the previous and this one, which is, I don't know about measuring it, though I think that's a really important idea. I think one thing is in terms of the work that I do, it's providing tools for people to represent what matters. So, and this is this idea of being very collaborative and giving people different options for how to talk about what's important to them. So I think at least the work that I'm doing is providing that menu of opportunities to be able to get stuff into the, to articulate it somehow, characterize it somehow, so that it's more clear who should be at the table. When before things can be invisible, but once they're made clear, it's more obvious who should participate. Thanks.
And I would just like to say in answer to that also, Taylor, okay, sorry, lost my train of thought. Come back to I had that thought I was going to say now. I forgot.
No problem. No problem. Did anyone else want to jump in? I think I see Jesse unmuting and maybe Bindu as well.
I think this is a really great question, so thanks for asking it. I think one important step is understanding the history of why things are the way they are, which is, as you said, alludes to the imbalance of the power in decision making, and understanding the legacy effects of historical injustices. So one really interesting example of this I saw in the New York Times maybe a week or two ago about a study that looks at how redlining different neighborhoods in the 1930s subsequently led to disinvestment, which is well documented, but in addition to that, led to increased levels of impervious surface and decreased tree canopy in those neighborhoods. And that has been linked to higher summer temperatures in those distinct neighborhoods and higher mortality from that as well. So I think being able to trace that imbalance in ecosystem service in the present to this historical legacy of redlining in the 30s, I think that type of understanding then provides important information today that leads to, okay, we need to really target these heat issues in neighborhoods that were historically redlined.
Real quickly. Oh, go ahead, Brenda. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Leon.
Oh, I just thought it came back to me real quick. So one of the, it doesn't really require us to take some specific metric to say, you know, how things are now. We really just need to take a look at the faces of the people who are making decisions, and really see that there's only one model for decision making that's been put in place in this country. And so to change that, you know, I don't think we really need to keep saying, well, what is the problem? I mean, I find that to be somewhat disingenuous when I hear folks saying, oh, you know, particularly, you know, for instance, the disruption that happened at the Capitol on January 6th. I hear a lot of pundits going, you know, why did it take this happen? Why did it take so long for this thing to go on? And so we really know what's going on. And so it doesn't take something so specific to measure to know how off things are. Sorry, Benny, go ahead.
Basically, building on what Leon said, what I wanted to point out was it's not just about procedural justice, you know, including people in decision making, but also what we're talking about is that communities are constituted by their values. But which community are we talking about? Whose knowledge are we talking about? And are they also adequately represented within decision making, or are we making decisions based on only one way of addressing particular issues? So when we're talking about collective values, when we're talking about community, you know, even within distributive based work, there is a tendency to look or prioritize the individual, right, and the economy to some extent. But when you're talking about collective values, you're getting into a very messy terrain. And so in that particular space, are we just kind of combining the collective and making it colorblind and erasing all the differences within the community and trying to find a single voice, or are we prioritizing the different voices of different groups and different ways of knowing within our decision making, and what would that look like? And I think the principles of justice essentially relate to human sociality, and that is something that we are really not taking into consideration. Issues of human sociality, issues of community, and also to me, I feel like the ultimate form of justice can be that of building a sense of belonging, that each community feels a sense of belonging within a particular place. And that too is a form of justice that need to be addressed, which probably cannot be addressed very neatly by studies and things like that. So we have to find other ways of addressing it than easy, quantitative studies, but perhaps mixed method studies, combining history, culture, all of this together.
That is a great comment to end on, and we do have to end on that. I just want to wrap up for a minute or two here because I know we are at the end of our time. I don't know about you all, but for me, this has been an amazingly inspiring hour and a half. So much important work done by people who are so thoughtful about the work they do and all the issues we threw at them afterwards. This has been a time of really intense learning and reading and discussing and introspection around issues of justice and equity and racism in this country and beyond. That's been true for me. It's been true for the Gund Institute, just understanding our role both in the problems and potential solutions and ramping up towards action. So this comes at a good time for that. I also want to just acknowledge and thank the Diversity Committee of the Gund Institute for so much energy and help on those sorts of discussions and reading and learning together, not only in this last year, but for 3 or 4 years since we formed it just after the Gund Institute relaunched itself. So that committee is gaining strength continuously, which is a great thing. 3 of the speakers are on it: Bindu, Pablo, Rachelle. It's currently chaired by Bindu and Jillian Galford. And there are about half a dozen other people on it. So if you want to learn more or get involved, you can get in touch with any of the people I just named or me to help with this kind of continuing process of learning and improvement. The last thing I want to do is announce one related event coming up, and that's Carolyn Finney's coming back. She's engaged all year as a Macmillan Scholar with the Gund Institute. She's coming for a lecture on April 16th. She'll also be doing individual meetings, I think, and a workshop with faculty this time. Last time was with students. So with those 2 quick little announcements, I just want to thank wholeheartedly our panelists for sharing their work with us, to all the amazing Gund staff who helped put this event together and everything else the Gund does, and to all of you for coming to participate and making it what it was. So big thanks to all those groups of people, and everyone, please enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
This has been recorded, and I will actually share the Q&A with the questions we didn't get to with the panelists to continue to sort of prod them to answer you if they can.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.